He laid every stone with his own hands. He carved the doors, raised the walls, polished the floors, and watched a mansion rise from bare earth into a symbol of wealth and power. Yet for decades, he was forbidden to step inside it. The house was his labor, his sweat, his life, but not his home. Enslaved by a man who trusted his skill but denied his humanity, he slept in the shadows of the estate he built, eating outside walls he knew better than anyone else. And only when the master finally died did the unthinkable happen. The slave was allowed to cross the threshold of the mansion he had created, not as a guest, not as an owner, but as a ghost of a system that had already stolen everything from him. He was chosen not for his obedience but for his hands, for the way his fingers understood wood and stone before words were ever spoken to him, for the quiet intelligence that could measure a beam by eye and feel when a wall was true without a level, long before the mansion existed, before the land was cleared or the foundations marked. His skill was already known, whispered among overseers who needed things built to last. He had learned as a boy, watching older men shape planks under punishment and praise alike, memorizing techniques because memory was the only thing that could not be whipped out of him. When the master decided to build a house that would announce his wealth to the world, a house meant to intimidate visitors and impress rivals, it was this enslaved man who was summoned, not as an architect in name but as one in function, expected to translate vague desires into solid form. He drew plans in the dirt with a stick, correcting them as the master frowned or nodded, adjusting proportions until they pleased a man who would never lift a tool himself. He calculated weight and balance in his head, knowing that if the roof sagged or a staircase failed, the blame would not fall on bad materials or rushed timelines but on his back. Each morning he arrived before dawn, unlocking nothing, entering nothing, simply standing outside the growing skeleton of the house, directing other enslaved laborers who trusted his judgment because it kept them alive. He selected timber, rejected flawed stone, and reinforced beams in places no visitor would ever see, building not just for beauty but for endurance, because collapse would mean death. As walls rose, so did the rules. He could work inside while construction demanded it, but only under watch, only while tools were in his hands, only as long as his presence served the house. When the floors were laid and the windows set, when the mansion began to resemble a finished home rather than a worksite, the boundary hardened. He was told where he could step and where he could not, which doors were now forbidden, which rooms were no longer his concern. The irony was cruel and precise. The closer the house came to completion, the further he was pushed away from its interior. His knowledge of the building became total even as his physical access vanished, every measurement and joint etched into his mind, every hidden support placed by his own hands. He built staircases he would never climb, smoothing banisters meant for hands that would never acknowledge his. He crafted door frames tall and elegant, knowing his own body would be stopped before crossing them. He installed fireplaces designed to warm rooms he would never sit in, chimneys that carried smoke away while he slept in the cold behind the house. The master praised the craftsmanship openly to guests, boasting about the mansion's solidity and beauty, yet referred to the man who built it as property, as if skill itself could be owned without recognizing the person who held it. Visitors admired the symmetry, the proportions, the way light entered through carefully placed windows, never knowing that the eye behind those choices belonged to someone forbidden from standing beside them to hear their praise. The mansion became a symbol long before it was occupied, a statement carved into the landscape that said who held power and who did not. For the enslaved builder, it became a daily lesson in erasure. He was trusted with the most critical decisions yet denied the simplest dignity, trusted to ensure the house would stand for generations yet deemed unworthy of stepping inside it once it was complete. At night, he would walk the perimeter, checking for settling cracks, listening to the wood adjust to temperature, knowing the sounds by heart. He could tell which room was which by the placement of windows and the way the wind moved through the structure, mapping the interior in his mind because mapping it with his feet was no longer allowed. Punishment lingered as an unspoken threat, reinforcing the rule without needing repetition. One misstep across the threshold, one moment of forgetting his place, and the same hands that built elegance could be broken to make an example. So he obeyed, standing outside while furniture was carried in, watching curtains hang in windows he had aligned perfectly, seeing life fill spaces he had emptied himself to create. The house began to host dinners and celebrations, laughter spilling out through doors he had carved, music echoing against walls he had raised, and he absorbed it all from a distance, the architect of a world he was barred from inhabiting. His exclusion was not accidental. It was essential to the system that exploited him, allowing him inside as anything other than labor would have acknowledged his humanity, his intellect, the truth that the mansion was as much his creation as the master's possession. So the rule remained absolute. He ate outside, rested outside, waited outside, rested outside, eaten outside. Even when rain lashed the walls he had sealed tight against weather, even when cold crept in fireplaces he built roared with warmth for others. The mansion stood finished, admired, envied, and he stood beside it, invisible, carrying the weight of every decision that made it stand. Over time, the house aged, but his memory of its birth never faded. He remembered the first stone placed, the first beam raised, the small corrections that prevented later disaster. He noticed when servants complained of drafts or creaks, knowing exactly which joint had shifted, which support needed attention. He was called to fix problems quietly, entering through service passages, working quickly, leaving no trace of himself behind. Each visit was a reminder of the contradiction at the heart of the place. The man who knew the house most intimately was the one least allowed to exist within it. The master grew older, slower, but the rule did not soften. Even illness did not grant mercy. Even when the mansion became quieter and rooms went unused, the enslaved builder continued to maintain the structure, preserving a legacy that would never credit him. He understood that the house would outlive them both, that long after his own name was forgotten, the mansion would still stand as proof of his skill without ever speaking it aloud. The walls held his labor like a secret, every corner marked by decisions made under coercion, every line a testament to brilliance constrained by chains. He did not dream of owning the house, because such dreams were dangerous, but he dreamed of walking through it freely, of standing in the central hall and hearing his footsteps echo without fear. That dream remained unrealized for as long as the master lived, the mansion remaining a forbidden space defined not by locks but by power, by the unspoken agreement that talent could be exploited while dignity was denied, by a rule enforced through generations that said a man could build a world he was never meant to enter, and stand outside it for a lifetime knowing every inch of it belonged to his hands but not to him, knowing that the doors he crafted so carefully would remain closed to him until something fundamental changed, until death itself intervened and the authority that barred him dissolved, leaving behind a house full of silent rooms and a man whose entire life had been poured into walls that never once allowed him to cross their threshold while the master still breathed. The mansion did not begin as a home, but as a declaration, a structure meant to announce dominance long before a single guest crossed its doorway. Its size was deliberate, its placement calculated to loom over the surrounding land like a warning. From a distance it looked magnificent, balanced and commanding, but up close it revealed the truth of how such beauty was achieved. Every wall was raised by hands that were not paid, every beam set by men who could be sold, beaten, or killed without consequence. The mansion's elegance depended entirely on suffering that was carefully hidden from those invited to admire it. Wealth did not merely purchase materials, it consumed lives, transforming stolen labor into prestige. For the master, the mansion was proof that he had risen above others, that his name deserved permanence. He spoke of it as legacy, something that would carry his status forward into the future, something solid enough to outlast memory. What he never spoke of was the cost measured not in money, but in human exhaustion. The enslaved laborers who built it were worked past the limits of their bodies, driven harder whenever deadlines slipped, punished whenever mistakes appeared. The mansion demanded perfection, and perfection was extracted through fear. Cracked hands, damaged backs, untreated injuries were accepted losses, invisible beneath smooth plaster and polished floors. The mansion reshaped the land around it, reorganizing space to reflect hierarchy. Paths led inward toward power, while quarters for the enslaved were pushed outward, hidden behind trees or terrain so visitors would not have to see them. The building's very layout reinforced control, with grand entrances for owners and guests, and narrow service passages for those who kept the house functioning. Even architecture became a tool of domination, teaching everyone who approached where they belonged and where they did not. The mansion was not neutral. It instructed obedience through scale and design. Cruelty was embedded not only in how the house was built, but in how it was used. Lavish dinners unfolded inside rooms whose walls echoed with laughter, while outside, hunger was routine. Warmth filled parlors and bedrooms, while those who maintained the fireplaces shivered at night. Music drifted through halls during celebrations, masking the sounds of labor that began before sunrise and ended after dark. The contrast was not accidental. Comfort existed because deprivation existed alongside it. Every indulgence depended on someone else being denied the same. Visitors saw the mansion as a marvel, a place of refinement that suggested intelligence and taste. They commented on craftsmanship, on how solid everything felt, how well the house aged. Compliments flowed easily because they required no moral accounting. To acknowledge the enslaved labor behind the structure would have complicated admiration, would have forced recognition that cruelty and beauty were intertwined. So guests accepted the illusion, praising the owner while ignoring the system that made such ownership possible. The mansion functioned as propaganda, presenting exploitation as success. Over time, the house became a model others sought to copy. Nearby landowners expanded their own estates, competing in size and luxury, each new mansion raising the bar of excess. This competition intensified cruelty across the region. As more labor was demanded, more punishment normalized, more lives shortened to achieve architectural prestige. The mansion was not an isolated injustice, but part of a broader machine that rewarded those willing to extract the most from the powerless. Its influence spread outward, shaping an economy built on domination. The enslaved workers understood the mansion differently. To them it was a ledger of pain, each room associated with injuries suffered during its construction, each feature recalling a moment of fear or exhaustion. A cracked rib remembered during the lifting of a beam, a scar earned when a tool slipped under pressure, a life lost when scaffolding failed and urgency mattered more than safety. The house absorbed these experiences silently, offering no acknowledgement, no memorial. It stood clean and impressive, its surfaces hiding the violence that made them possible. Ownership of the mansion reinforced the idea that people, like property, could be controlled absolutely. If a man could command a structure of such size and complexity, if he could bend land and labor to his will, then the ownership of human beings seemed to him a natural extension of that power. The house validated his authority daily, reminding everyone who entered that this was a place where his word shaped reality. Rules enforced outside the mansion were mirrored inside it, hierarchy fixed into walls and ceilings that dictated movement and behavior. As years passed, the mansion aged into respectability. What began as a shocking display of excess slowly normalized, its presence accepted as part of the landscape. Children grew up knowing it as a landmark, a symbol of stability rather than exploitation. Time softened outrage, turning brutality into tradition. The origin of the house faded from conversation, replaced by stories of important guests and memorable events. The suffering that built it became history, then rumor, then silence. Yet the stolen labor remained embedded in every inch of the structure. Even when repairs were made, even when renovations updated its appearance, the foundation rested on coercion. The mansion could not escape its origins because they were structural, not symbolic. Its very existence depended on the idea that some lives could be spent to elevate others. No amount of admiration could erase that truth. No celebration could cleanse the walls of what they represented. For those forced to serve within it, the mansion was a daily reminder of inequality made permanent. They moved through spaces designed to exclude them, maintaining luxury they could never enjoy. Their presence was required, but their humanity denied. Their labor essential, but their humanity denied. Their labor essential, but their lives disposable. Yet it refused to acknowledge that dependence. It stood as a monument to a system that converted stolen time, stolen strength, stolen futures into something admired and envied. The mansion's power lay in its ability to disguise cruelty as accomplishment. It taught that greatness could be built on injustice and still be celebrated. That beauty did not require morality, only resources and control. By standing intact and admired, it argued silently that exploitation worked, that it produced results worth preserving. That message endured long after individual acts of violence were forgotten, long after the screams and punishments faded from memory. In this way, the mansion became more than a building. It became an argument made of stone and wood, insisting that domination could be elegant, that suffering could be transformed into status, that stolen labor could be admired without shame. It stood as proof that cruelty did not always appear monstrous, that it could dress itself in symmetry and proportion, inviting praise rather than condemnation, continuing to command respect even as it rested entirely on lives it had consumed, on hands that built it under force, on a system that turned human beings into tools and then erased them from the story once the work was done. The master's death did not arrive with ceremony for those who had lived beneath his rule, only with a sudden shift in silence. The house that had once pulsed with authority felt suspended, as if the walls themselves were waiting for instruction that would never come. For years, every rule had traced back to a single living body, to a voice that decided who could move where, who could speak, who could exist within certain spaces. When that voice stopped, the mansion remained standing, intact and imposing, but its power felt altered, no longer actively enforced yet not entirely gone. The enslaved man who had built it sensed the change before anyone spoke it aloud, noticing how servants hesitated, how doors were left unguarded a moment longer than usual, how orders were repeated less sharply, as if habit rather than conviction kept them alive. News of the death traveled through whispers rather than announcements. No one knew immediately what it meant, only that something final had occurred. The rules had not been revoked, but their source had vanished, leaving uncertainty in its place. The mansion entered a strange pause, mourning rituals unfolding inside rooms that had never known the grief of those who built them. Curtains were drawn, mirrors covered, footsteps softened, yet the house did not belong to the dead man anymore in the way it once had. Ownership would be discussed later, divided among heirs or absorbed by legal structures that cared little for the people bound to the estate. In that gap between death and decision, the boundaries that had seemed immovable grew faint. For the enslaved builder, the moment carried weight that was difficult to name. He did not celebrate because death did not restore what had been taken, did not erase years of exclusion or fear. Yet something loosened inside him, a tension held so long it had become invisible. The rule that barred him from the interior of the mansion had been enforced by a living will, by the threat of punishment delivered personally or through loyal hands. With that will gone, the rule lingered only as memory, strong but unsupported. He found himself standing closer to the entrance than he ever had before, not because anyone invited him, but because no one stopped him. Inside, preparations continued as if nothing fundamental had changed. Candles were lit, floors cleaned, rooms arranged for visitors who would come to pay respects. Servants moved carefully, glancing toward doors that once marked danger, now uncertain whether those dangers still applied. The builder was summoned for repairs, as he often had been, asked to fix a hinge, inspect a beam, address a problem that required his knowledge. This time, the request came without warning attached, without reminders of where he could and could not go. He stepped through a doorway that had once represented punishment, his movements so quiet it went unnoticed at first. Crossing the threshold did not feel triumphant. It felt unreal, like stepping into a place he had already lived in for years through memory alone. Every detail was familiar before his eyes confirmed it. The angles of the walls, the height of the ceiling, the spacing of the windows matched exactly what he had carried in his mind. His feet moved along paths he had traced mentally countless times, his hands brushing surfaces he had smoothed long ago. There was no sense of discovery, only recognition, as if the house had been waiting for him to arrive physically after hosting him invisibly for decades. No one stopped him because no one quite knew whether they were allowed to. Authority had fragmented, and in that fragmentation, rules lost clarity. Some servants looked at him with surprise, others with something close to understanding, as if they recognized the quiet justice of the moment, even if they could not say it aloud. He did not announce himself, did not ask permission, did not claim the space as his own. He simply existed within it, a presence long denied now, briefly tolerated by uncertainty. The rooms felt different from how he had imagined them, not in shape or size, but in atmosphere. They carried the weight of decisions made without him, of lives lived at his exclusion. Furniture sat where he had once envisioned empty space. Decorations filled walls he had intended to remain bare. The house had been completed without his participation in its life, altered by tastes that were not his. Yet beneath those layers, the structure remained true to his design, responding to light and sound exactly as he had planned. The house behaved as he had taught it to, solid and obedient, even in the absence of its master. He noticed small imperfections no one else ever would, slight shifts that came with time, wood settling, stone adjusting. These signs felt intimate, like the aging of a body he knew well. He corrected what he could, tightening, reinforcing, preserving the integrity of the building out of habit rather than obligation. Even now, even with the rule broken, his relationship to the house remained defined by labor, by care given without acknowledgement. The difference was that this time, his presence was not immediately punished. The master's death did not transform the system that had enslaved him. Papers would still list him as property. Decisions about his fate would still be made without his consent. The mansion, though briefly accessible, was not suddenly his. Yet stepping inside altered something quieter and deeper. The house could no longer exist as a space completely closed to him, even if future owners reinstated old rules. Even if punishment returned with renewed force, the threshold had been crossed once, proving that exclusion had never been natural, only enforced. He stood in the central hall and listened to the way sound traveled, confirming what he already knew, that the acoustics carried voices upward, that footsteps echoed longer than expected. He imagined what it would have been like to walk here freely, to sit, to rest, to exist without purpose beyond being present. That imagining did not turn into longing so much as recognition of what had been denied, a clarity sharpened by proximity. Outside, life continued much as it always had. Work waited, expectations remained, and freedom was not granted by a single death. The mansion would pass into other hands, and those hands might tighten control once uncertainty ended. The moment was fragile, temporary, existing only because no one had yet decided how to replace the authority that had vanished. He understood that this access could close again without warning, that the walls could once more become barriers rather than shelter. Still, the fact remained that the master was gone, and with him the unquestioned certainty of exclusion. The house no longer answered to a living command that defined who belonged and who did not. Even if the system endured, it now carried a crack, a visible flaw in its permanence. The enslaved builder moved through rooms he had shaped, leaving no mark of rebellion, only the quiet truth of his presence. A truth the mansion itself could not deny, because every inch of it bore his decisions, his labor, his intelligence, and now, at last, the weight of his footsteps moving freely through space that had always known him. Space that had never truly belonged to the master alone. Space that had been waiting for the moment when death loosened its grip enough for the man who built it to finally stand inside it, not as property or tool, but as a living contradiction to the rule that had kept him outside for so long. Here's a asterisk, strong, cinematic ending that fits the tone and closes the story with weight. The mansion still stands today, admired for its beauty, photographed for its grandeur, protected as heritage, yet its walls carry a truth the guidebooks rarely speak aloud. It was not built by privilege alone, but by a man whose name history tried to erase, whose hands shaped greatness while his life was confined by chains. The fact that he entered only after death removed his master exposes the lie at the heart of power built on slavery, that ownership was never strength, only force. The house survived the master, but it could not outlive the truth embedded in its foundation. Every beam remembers who truly built it. Every room stands as silent testimony that brilliance can be enslaved, dignity can be denied, but human worth cannot be permanently locked outside the doors it creates.